You just bring it.
Yeah. Now my story about Modi rushing into a TV interview. Anyway. Okay. Yeah, sure. Hello? Hello? Yeah. Whichever way. I'm okay. Yeah. No. No.
Hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I'll. Okay, well, we have.
No.
Off again.
No. No.
You are being silenced, Madhu.
Can you hear me now? Great. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for being patient while we got our act together. We have with us two journalists who have written very different. I wonder what's going on there that I'm missing. Anyway, but we'll be good. Both of them have written amazing books, very different from each other. Rajdeep's is about the May 2014 election and how it changed India. Mihir's is after that, on what is wrong with the economy in India and what should be done. Both, I would suggest that you start with Rajdeep's and then read Mihir's. It's sort of written almost in progression. I'll start with Rajdeep. Rajdeep, why did you write this book? And while the elections were going on, were you making notes preparing for this book? Or did it come afterwards when you had a, should we put it politely, a hiatus?
No, I'd love to say that I was planning this book for years on end, that I knew in what was it, 1990 September, when I first met Narendra Modi, that I've seen the next Prime Minister of India, or I've seen the man who's going to be the most powerful Indian since Indira Gandhi. I wish I could have said all that. All that I remember was that I saw a man who even then wore spotless white kurta pajamas. He obviously didn't change his clothes as often as he does now. You know, he wasn't a serial dresser that he is now.
No, but he was always stitch.
He was always perfectly dressed.
Groomed. Grooming was good. Like,
Yeah, he was well groomed. But if you ask me that in 1990 was I going to write a book called 2014, the election that changed India, with a photograph of Narendra Modi at the very top, I wouldn't have. I think sometime in early 2014 was when I started thinking about the idea that here was someone who was probably going to win the election and going to win it big, and was reflective in a way of an India that was changing. And it was out of that really that I thought that it was time to maybe put together something, my thoughts on Mr. Modi. For some strange reason, Mr. Modi and I have had various encounters, good, bad and ugly. Unfortunately, in recent times, they've been more ugly than good and bad.
But you gave him your book.
I've sent him my book. I don't know whether he's read it. I'm also going to translate it in Gujarati in case he hasn't read it in English. But the fact is that I think he represented a fascinating change that was taking place in Indian politics. The book is not just about him. The book is about how India has changed, how the politics. I mean, this book wouldn't have been possible without Rahul Gandhi also helping me out. I mean, I think just as Rahul Gandhi helped Narendra Modi in a way, he helped me win. Because every book needs a sort of lead actor, and it needs
Comic
court
relief,
jester.
comic relief, comic
The
relief.
court jester.
That's your words, not mine.
Comic relief.
I get into trouble every time I say anything nowadays, so I'm going to be very careful.
Well, journalists are supposed to be in trouble, not going and getting Padma Shris.
That's true. But the point is, I think you have a fascinating array of characters who in a sense reflect the changing India. I think Rahul Gandhi reflects an India of another era. Narendra Modi reflects an India with its good, bad and ugly sides of a new India. And I think we need to sort of recognize the change, the power shift that's taking place. But at the end of the day, this is a journalist narrative. So this is full of stories.
Rajdeep, the title of your book, The Election That Changed India. Don't you think it was the other way around, that Modi changed the election this time? It was more presidential, it was more personality oriented, it was governance, the whole issue of, oh Lord.
Okay, you've got to speak louder.
Okay. Don't you think that it was the other way around, that you say, your title says that the election that changed India, 2014, don't you think it was the other way around, that Narendra Modi changed this election?
Let me be very honest. I believe that the Congress party would have lost this election even if Narendra Modi was not the prime ministerial candidate of the BJP. Let's be clear. I mean, every time I go to gatherings like this and I say something about Rahul Gandhi, there are claps and Twitter, people start laughing. And I think the worst thing that happens to a politician is when people start laughing. And it almost then, to me, suggested that whoever else contested would have probably had the advantage. The Congress, and to be fair to poor old Rahul, he was facing 10 years of baggage of a Manmohan Singh who was, who the joke goes, never opened his mouth unless the dentist called him. And the fact is that, Modi has to give thank you cards to Rahul, to Manmohan, to Akhilesh Yadav, to Mani Shankar Iyer for suddenly reminding Narendra Modi that actually his father was a chaiwala. I mean, in the 15 years that I knew Modi from 1990 to 2005, when I'd regularly meet him, Mr. Modi never told me that his origins were that of a tea boy. But he capitalized on the moment or seized on what was provided to him. And he owes a thank you card to us in the media. He owes a thank you card to Arvind Kejriwal for walking out after 49 days. But he owes a big thank you card to us in the media also. So I think...
He doesn't think so.
He doesn't. No, I think Modi would have still won the election and the Congress would have still lost the election, irrespective of what else happened. There was anger out there.
But he has a lot of anger and criticism of particularly the English television media.
Narendra Modi is a brilliant strategist. He has used people like me or the English language media as the so-called villains to project himself as the hero. I've always... The fact is that there is a chapter of his life that he doesn't want us to look into. And I am not a cheerleader or a Modi bhakt. So I'm going to keep showing that part of his life, as I will show the positive sides of the man. The problem is that we've become a more intolerant society. So if I ask questions which Mr. Modi or his bhakts, as I call them, don't like, then I am the villain. And Mr. Modi has preyed on that. I resent the fact that the Prime Minister of this country calls journalists news traders. Journalists who ask the Prime Minister of this country questions are called news traders. To me, that is akin to being called a prostitute. And I believe journalists should question the Prime Minister instead of taking selfies with the Prime Minister. Selfies are taken by bhakts. Questions, my job is going to be to continue to ask the questions, irrespective of what he'd like. The only benefit that I will not get is I won't be invited to Obama's dinner. And Mr. Swapan Das Gupta will probably be invited to the dinner.
Let's not get personal.
That's the difference. And
Mihir, can we bring Mihir in a little
Sure.
bit? Mihir, you have some, we had a discussion earlier, and you had some views about Rahul Gandhi during the election. I don't know why I'm... Mihir
Okay, can
had
you hear
some
me?
views on Rahul Gandhi in a discussion that we had earlier Could you talk about that now?
Well, I think that, I think in many ways Rajdeep has said exactly what I would wanted to say. I find it impossible to imagine that anyone can recover a political career from being the kind of punchline that Rahul Gandhi is now. It's almost an easy laugh, it's like, it's sort of that same kind of slightly bad taste, but you really want to laugh. That Sardarji jokes were 10 years ago. So it's like the Sardarji joke has been replaced by a Rahul Gandhi joke, Rahul is so dumb that...
Tell us a Rahul Gandhi joke now.
And
not the politics is in your shirt and in your pant.
A Rahul Gandhi joke
Actually, in all fairness to him, we journalists didn't have to make jokes because a lot of what he said was just run as he said it.
Let me tell you a real life story. Forget about a joke. In the course of trying to research the book, I tried to find out why Rahul Gandhi was not on Twitter and Facebook. Because, to Mr. Modi's great credit, Mr. Modi understood the power of the media. He was on Twitter, Facebook, 64-year-old man, through his team, of course, was constantly there sending out brilliant messaging. I mean, he ran a brilliant campaign. On the other hand, Rahul Gandhi was not on Twitter and Facebook. So I asked a Congress leader, why is your leader, young man, not on a young person medium? He said, Rahul likes direct communication. And I tried to understand what does direct communication mean. He said if he's on Facebook and Twitter and he has these lakhs of followers, he wants to directly communicate to each of them, and that won't be possible. So here is someone...
I think that exposes what Twitter, he wasn't ready to deal with Twitter, because in Twitter, as you know, Twitter is, in quotes, a cesspool. You get abused, as both of us have. Mihir has 2-3, and we get regularly abused for our views. We take it, it's part of the game. It's also that you get exposed to people that you would normally never get exposed to. So ordinary people, students, people from all walks of life will attack you, and you have to deal with it. And I think that was the point, that he was not prepared to deal with that.
I don't know whether he's not prepared to deal with that. I just think Mr. Narendra Modi understood New India better than him. One of the statistics of this election is in the age group between 18 and 23. The BJP got 37% of the vote. The Congress got 16% of the vote. Now, why does a 64-year-old, my son wanted to vote for Narendra Modi.
Mihir, you had some views on the youth,
well, I think
how the youth demographic affected this past election.
Well, I think it was very interesting that when the 282 seats that the NDA came in on May the 16th, and a lot of us were surprised because we expected a BJP victory. I think a lot of us were surprised by its scale, including many people in the BJP. And the truth was that if you wandered around, parts of North India, which the BJP subsequently swept, if you talk to anyone above the age of 30, it was like a regular election. It was like any other election that this country had gone through in the past 20 years. They were angry about someone, but they had certain loyalties, they had caste loyalties, they had community loyalties, and you heard the same arguments. You met people under the age of 30, and suddenly it was a completely different story. In fact,
there was passion.
There was a passion, and in fact, I wrote a column saying that I couldn't find a Modi wave anywhere in UP except in a college in Raebareli, in the middle of Sonia Gandhi's constituency. And the truth was that I made the mistake of only going to one college. If I had gone to all the colleges in the proportion that young people are in our country, I would have figured out that they'd get 85 seats in UP, or whatever, 82 seats in UP. So the truth is that people under 30 have been lost to the Congress and possibly to the kind of broad social democratic ideology the Congress represents forever.
I think there are two reasons for that. I think if you look at the 18 to 23 age group, this is the first, what I call the post-liberalization generation. They all grew up after 1991. They've not known scarcity. They're looking at the choices between Kentucky Fried, and it's aspirational. Even the pizza delivery boy, what Modi calls the neo-middle class.
Rajdeep, the other thing is that this generation has not grown up as we had, with one government-owned news channel with no private company allowed to broadcast. Can most of you, as I look around, young people, can you imagine that? That there's only one government channel and you cannot see what's going on, you only read it in the newspapers? That was what it was like before it opened up. And that has been the big change. It's the complete revolution and the fastest ever. But it's not all good, is it?
No, it's, look, it's at one level, it's a generation which is aspirational, which is impatient for change. And I think that sense of constant desire for change is reflected in younger India. Because the pizza, I think that neo-middle class, what Modi calls the neo-middle class, which is basically the pizza delivery boy or someone who is a first generation, who simply gets, say, 10,000 rupees salary. His father probably cannot speak English. He can speak broken English. He's determined to get ahead. The one thing that unites every Indian today is aspiration. And Modi tapped into that far more intelligently than the Congress. So Rahul Gandhi would go to UP and say, "Arey, aap log kyun bheek mangne jate ho Mumbai ko?" No Indian today wants to be told that he's going to Mumbai to beg. He's going there as an economic migrant. Modi will go there and say, "Main aapko 24 ghante bijli launga." He represented hope. Now, whether that hope is fulfilled or not is another matter. But today he represented for a younger India hope, communicated that, and this younger generation in 2002, which was the darkest moment of Modi's political career, was simply 8 years old, 7 years old.
Rajdeep,
so they have no memory of it.
Why don't you read a passage from your book?
On 2002, that will get me into trouble.
It's in the book. You couldn't be in more trouble.
Yeah, well, there are, sure. I mean, there are two chapters.
Rather than 2002, I think it would be interesting either if you read the one where the early years, or the watershed moment of this election.
I think that the three things that you noticed about Modi, that's a lovely section.
Yeah, well, look, there's one about, I mean, I think it's important that they know about the riots. I mean, why should...
And who doesn't know about the riots? Let's move on. Let's get to your book.
Okay, I'm going to read out a thing just to show how the old Indian saying, "Har kutte ka din aata hai," every dog has his day. How the world changes. Modi took to television rather well in the late 1990s. I recall two telling instances. Once I was anchoring a 10 p.m. show called News Hour on NDTV with Arnab Goswami. So you can imagine the voice levels of that show. Arnab would later anchor a similar named primetime show with great success on Times Now. At about 8:30 p.m., our scheduled BJP guest Vijay Kumar Malhotra dropped out. We were desperate for a replacement. I said I knew one person in Delhi who might oblige us at this late hour. I rang up Modi and spoke to him in Gujarati. I've always believed that a way to a person's heart is to speak to them in their mother tongue, a tactic that every reporter learns while trying to charm the power food chain from VIPs down to their PAs and PSs. Avi jao Narendra bhai, tamari jarurat chhe. Please come, Narendra bhai, we need you. Mr. Modi was clever even then, knew that he was a last-minute replacement. Modi hemmed and hawed for all of 60 seconds and then said he was ready to appear on our show but didn't have a car. Modi at the time lived in 9 Ashoka Road next to the BJP office along with other pracharaks. I asked him to take a taxi and promised that we would reimburse him. Gujaratis notoriously would not, possibly Rajasthanis too. Arnab and I sweated in anticipation as the countdown began for 10 p.m. With minutes to go, there was still no sign of Modi. With about 5 minutes left to on air, with producers already yelling "stand by" in my ear, a panting Modi came scurrying into the studio crying out, "Rajdeep, avigyo means I have come, I have come." He was fully aware he was only a last-minute replacement, but so unwilling was he to give up a chance at a TV appearance, he made sure he showed up even at the 11th hour.
And how the tables have turned. Rajdeep has been trying for an interview with him.
That's okay. That's life.
For years and he's not got it yet.
That's life. He's changed, I haven't.
I had a confirmed interview with him, which he backed out of at the last minute. There was a Twitter war, shall we call it. It brings us to the subject, Mihir, of access. We journalists are controlled by this, by whether we'll get access or not. So if you write something negative, you can be sure that it won't be easy to get the next interview. So do you think, how do you play this? I know how I play it. How do you play this? How do you play this, Rajdeep? That we always know that when you ask the uncomfortable question, there is the danger that somebody will walk off, which has happened with Narendra Modi in Karan Thapar's interview, with Ram Jethmalani also. He's also walked off with Karan Thapar. There is that danger, and then also we have to get the stories, and they are our source. So well, how do you play this? And the biggest problem that we found historically is that the journalists who get the interviews, for example, the one person who Sonia Gandhi is willing to be interviewed by was Veer Sanghvi, because there was an agreement that certain questions would not be asked. And taking it further, my second question, follow-up to that is, should journalists then make agreements that, okay, I will stay away from, say, 2002, but I still want the interview? Do we, I know that has happened with many journalists with Narendra Modi. So how do you deal with that? Access and making the deal to not ask uncomfortable questions in order to get the interview.
I think that it's important to notice that, first of all, you can't get away with not ask. Your audience will always ask you why you haven't asked that question. So if somebody interviews Robert Vadra tomorrow, all right, and they don't ask about land deals, there's not much point. If somebody interviews Rahul Gandhi and doesn't ask about 1984 or something like that, and Arnab did ask about 1984, and Rahul had possibly the worst answer known to man.
That he was too young.
That he was six years old and therefore hadn't actually killed anyone. So it was the essential point being that if you don't ask those questions, people will not take your interview seriously. Now, the way that the current dispensation, which is of course Machiavellian in its brilliance, has gotten around this is by saying that, look, we won't have any interviews at all. We will simply starve you. Even if the cabinet meets at 5 o'clock, we will release what the cabinet has done at 10:30 at night, so it's too late for primetime TV, and the newspapers can't run any analysis of it. So it comes in at 10:30, all right, the late night desk at every newspaper says, oh, dash it, we've got, important news from the cabinet, it's passed an ordinance or something or the other. Oh, unfortunately, we can't do any analysis of it, we just have to run the Press Information Bureau note as is. Now,
he clarified that very blatantly. He said right after he was sworn in, that the media is not going to set the agenda for the government. The government is going to set the agenda. And today, just to take it a little further, today there is an article by Arun Jaitley, the Minister of Information and Broadcasting, in Times of India. I mentioned their brand, although they will never mention any others unless they're paid for. He's written an extensive article, almost a reassurance to journalists and the media that we will not censor you, we will not prevent you from, freedom of speech is paramount. And also written that Article 352, for young people who are not familiar with this, that's the emergency. Even if an emergency was called, you could not control the internet. However, that was on the editorial page. On page 1, the newly appointed censor board chief has now announced that he's not only going to censor films, he also wants to censor television, because there's too much of nudity in fashion shows, and also he wants to censor the internet. Although his own Minister of Information and Broadcasting has said it's not possible to control the internet. So if they're going to make the same mistakes that the Congress party made by adding on Section 66A and trying to control an uncontrollable beast,
I think they've already made some of those mistakes. I mean, they tried to block a couple of websites, and they're actually going to struggle with the internet the same way the Congress did. I find what I find most interesting, however, is the assumption that they have made that if I just put out my side of the story and then shut up shop, I refuse to answer questions, I refuse to take one-on-one interviews with journalists, I mean, not just the Prime Minister, a lot of other senior ministers.
That's what they're doing.
Then they will just, the press will just repeat what I am saying without any further analysis. So far, I think it's working. At some point, the average newspaper, even if they don't want to do that extra work, will realize you can get ahead by questioning the government, by doing that little value added that says, okay, this is what they're saying, but actually it's not true. People will buy that newspaper, people will watch that TV channel, people will follow that journalist on Twitter. And therefore, I think it's actually not a good strategy for the government, because they're incentivizing journalists to do more work.
No, hold on. I'm going to reverse this whole thing. We can keep blaming the politicians. The fact is, and I'm going to say this with all seriousness, in the 1970s, a political party, i.e. the Congress under Indira Gandhi, censored the media in the emergency years.
Let me explain it a little
just
bit.
a minute.
Magazines were, India Today had to be, I had to take it personally in 1975 to a man called Dipena, who used to read it and stamp every page that it was okay. Can you imagine that in every print magazine had to go through that censor? It's unbelievable. That's what we lived through.
But the fact is that a number of journalists at that time stood up and said, we will not accept it. Many of them walked out, many of them crawled, but a number of them stood up. What has happened today? As I said, today journalists would prefer to take selfies or are more than happy to take one-way information from the government. You have a situation, and it's happening in Delhi at the moment, what I call supari journalism. 3 or 4 channels have taken a supari to prevent Arvind Kejriwal from getting any media space. It's happening openly.
Are you clapping? One second. Are you clapping that you approve?
This country has reached the stage where debates are taking place on news channels where you will not allow a representative of the Aam Aadmi Party. You will carry a debate, interestingly, on whether there should be a presidential debate between Kejriwal and Bedi, and you will have the debate between Congress and BJP but won't have the Aam Aadmi Party. Why? Because your owners today want Arvind Kejriwal out. You have other owners. You have a media owner who sits with the Prime Minister, campaigns with him in Haryana. And that's the truth. I didn't know whether this is the right forum to say that, but because of obvious reasons. But that is the truth. Sits with him because he wants a Rajya Sabha seat. What do you expect the journalists of that channel to do?
Well, that
you have now, the fact
fired a journalist day before yesterday because he said that he would cover, he was told he was not allowed to cover Arvind Kejriwal. And he said he refused to, he was called into the HR department, he was told to resign, he refused to resign, and then they called him up 2 hours later and they said, you're fired. That's where we are today. That either you toe the line of the owner who is supporting a particular party or politician and is getting his benefits through for his other businesses, or you lose your bread and butter.
No, but the fact is for the longest time, why are the politicians today contemptuous of the media? Because we have allowed standards to fall. We have become, we carry Nautanki every night on prime time. Let's be honest. We do tamasha, right? So therefore, if the Prime Minister of the country calls me a news trader, I may object after 26 years. But there are people out there who saying these media wale aise hi hain. So Narendra Modi, in a sense, is reflecting the contempt increasingly that the viewer or the reader has for the media. And we have been responsible for our own downfall. We today will not stand up when a journalist is removed because he objects to, let's say, Kejriwal not getting space. We will not stand up when standards are falling, when you have 10 people shouting at each other, when we conduct kangaroo trials night after night. We will not stand up. And because we are not willing to stand up and say we don't have any clothes and we are naked, the Prime Minister and the politicians are saying, you guys are tamashawalas, notankis, news traders. Why should I talk to you? And we've reduced ourselves in our own eyes. That's what's happened. And that's the serious crisis that we face. It's a serious crisis. Why blame Narendra Modi? We should blame, 20 years ago, editors lost their backbone. We have lost the authority, the moral authority today to question the Prime Minister because we are so interested in doing everything else but journalism anymore.
But in all fairness, I must interject and explain that 20 years ago, one news organization, when there was a complete wall between church and state, which is marketing, business, and editorial, and it was never crossed, that owner decided to blend it by selling editorial space. First in the party pages, and then it started creeping into the corporate pages, the business pages, and then into editorial. A lot of other editors objected. He said, all of you will follow me. What did he do? He reduced the price of the newspaper so low because his revenue model was to make money by selling editorial space. And the others were forced to follow to survive, which I don't approve of, and I don't think any journalist would approve of, and started calling them impact feature, advertorial, or a little. As a matter of fact, the largest newspaper in the world, not India, in the world, the largest circulation, if you read carefully, and I beseech you to read more carefully and reject those kind of stories and those papers. An example is a funeral report of the report on the funeral of the former Maharaja of Mysore. Now, this newspaper does not allow a brand to be mentioned unless it's paid for. But in this report, a BMW was mentioned with a description of the make and the model and the benefits of it 6 times. Because he says in the report, the Maharaja liked his BMW, this make and this number, and it has so many cylinders and engines, in a funeral report. And his body didn't fit in that, so they brought him another BMW, and then they gave a full report. This is not by accident. You, as readers, have to be aware of this. Let's get back to your books. we got waylaid. Mihir, would you like to read from your book?
Sure. Okay. All right. Just as respect is not, here this is essentially what I'm trying to talk about, what people actually expect out of this election, what people expect Narendra Modi to deliver for them. And so let me just read and we'll talk. Just as respect is not our birthright, neither is growth. An overconfidence about our destiny has been the hallmark of policy making in India since 1991. It is almost as if we genuinely believe all the lies about ourselves that we tell foreign investors. Never trust people who read their own PR. If anything has emerged from our story so far, it is this, that we stop short of real reform. We think tinkering around a bit is the Indian way. It is gradualism. Are we not a 5,000-year-old civilization? We aren't, actually, but that will require another book to explain. We cannot be hustled along by all you economists with all your theories. We are wiser than that. But here's why I think that in spite of all the disappointments that India has served up to optimists over and again, that the rickety old bus that is the Indian economy could still discover hitherto unsuspected horsepower. First, because I think that a genuine appreciation of the scale of the challenge and of the need for real and painful change has been built up. Remember, this is the challenge, that 13 million young people enter the workforce every damn year, and that there is only 1 million jobs. This is not something that any civilization, no matter how old it imagines itself, can endure unchanged. And the pressures that it creates within itself are explosive. Which is why this time, in 2014, there is a very palpable willingness to accept even painful change. We sense that where we must go, there are no maps. Growth itself has its pressures. Even rigid political systems in homogeneous societies struggle with the transformations imposed upon them by sustained high growth. The People's Republic of China, for example. But when it is accompanied by a major demographic shift as well, then there are neither guides nor precedents. Let me tell you a story. This is a story from eastern Uttar Pradesh, one of the most difficult parts of India, fiendishly complex, Byzantine in its politics of kinship, of patronage, riven with division and struggling under the burden of some of the worst human development indicators in the world. This is the region where young men in Ayodhya, smartly dressed, signal their desperation nevertheless to be a guide to the famed and disputed center of the old temple town by rubbing their bellies in simulated hunger. This is the region where the men of Padrona sit outside their shuttered factory, desperate to protect its machinery from looters that include the factory's owner. In the far southeast of this region lies the district of Mirzapur. It is poor even for eastern UP. Not all of it is covered by the rich brown loam of the plains, for this is where the plateau begins with its red earth and rock. Here, 4 of India's poorest states, Uttar Pradesh, Madhya Pradesh, Bihar, and Chhattisgarh meet. It is a home, among millions of others, of Ram Charan, a man who, like his father before him and his grandfather before that, plays the drum. He has never left Mirzapur. In fact, he hardly ever goes down to the district town in the plains. But, he told me, his younger relatives are a problem. They want to leave. And they will have to, he added, dropping his voice. Because if they stay, there will be trouble. They do not know how to behave. When he said this, there was no note of disapproval in his voice. For when young Dalit men do not know how to behave, something else is being said. They do not know their place, is what he means. They will have to leave, he concluded, because there are no jobs here. This is a familiar refrain, so I nodded with an air of patience. He looked at me sharply and said, once there could have been. And then, with the help of a friend standing nearby, he ticked off the factories that had once been within walking distance of his village: cement, carpets, and glass. But they could not reopen, I told him. They might never make money in Mirzapur. He did not disagree, but patiently explained that I had missed the point. His point was that he knew, as did everyone around him, where jobs came from. They were not fools, he said, demanding jobs from nowhere. They knew jobs came from factories, and if there were none here, the young men could be sent to where they were. For decades, since Narasimha Rao, our leaders have feared to tell us the truth, that people will have to move to where the jobs are. They have run from the needs and from the consequences of reform. They have hidden what we need behind a bushel of evasions and promises and outright lies. Today, Indians already know, and their smarter politicians may have started agreeing with them too. Whatever else may have been behind Narendra Modi's clean sweep of India's left-behind north, it did reveal how widespread the expectation and the demand for the deepest of change was. Modi was not a candidate who was expected to do anything by half measures. He was not a candidate whom people looked at as anything but a radical break from the old order. He was not a candidate who they thought would shy away from inflicting pain if that was what he thought was necessary. We can disagree about what Modi is or what he has done, but what he has hoped to be is not something that can be any disagreement about. If he tinkers at the margins, if he stops short, it will be the Indian state's final betrayal of those who have patiently and for decades expected so much from it. This time, I fear, they will not be as quick to forgive.
Thank you, Mihir. Mihir's book, the first part of it, addresses the problems in a rather unique way. It's highly readable, it's funny, witty. It's a book on the economy, and I am not good at reading those kind of books, but this is a really funny, easy read. You've talked about three big questions. And you've also talked about can you talk about the bulge that you say is one of the biggest problems?
Well, I think that, as I said, there are 13 million people, 13 million young kids, all right, who enter the job market every year. They leave their homes, they sometimes leave their villages, their small towns, and they're looking for jobs. They have expectations of their future. And we have only 1 million jobs a year to provide for them. How are those 12 million remaining people going to make a life for themselves? How are they going to settle down? What kind of future do they imagine for themselves? Now, the truth is, under Narendra Modi, they have this expectation, because of the campaign that he ran, that something will happen for them in the next 5 years.
Mihir, let me ask you one thing. That in your book, you have, in 5 pages, and I don't exaggerate, he's listed all the legal requirements a factory owner has to fulfill. And it takes 5 pages, each line taking a different registration, license, a register to maintain. 5 pages of that. And nothing has been done, and that's why there is a complete discouragement in even going to build a factory to meet all those requirements, and an inspector comes and finds one little thing wrong to make money out of it, and you're screwed. Now, what is the solution? Because so far, Narendra Modi has not done anything to dismantle all the socialistic restrictions that were put in by Jawaharlal Nehru and Indira Gandhi.
The essential thing, I think, is that Mr. Modi hasn't quite figured out one really important thing. In some ways, his ambition isn't quite grand enough, which is a strange thing to say about Narendra Modi. He hasn't figured out that he will need to, in fact, change all these laws. Sometimes he says so. At Madison Square Garden, he stood up and said, I feel sometimes that I should remove one old law a week. The truth is, however, he hasn't got around to doing that. There are dozens and dozens of laws that you need to satisfy to run any kind of business in this country. Every single person who runs a business in this country is a criminal. And not because they want to be, it's because the laws contradict each other. All right? They came in at different points, something in the 1870s, something in the 1920s. It is absolutely impossible to be an honest businessman. Somebody from Gujarat, somebody who runs a business-friendly administration, should have been able to say, step one, I'm going to change every single one of these things by the time I leave office. The truth is that instead what he has done, claiming that he is changing labor laws, is to say, look, I'll put some of the compliance certificates with this online. Okay, now this is classic Narendra Modi. It's like, I think that there's some kind of quick digital fix, and then I will sell this as genuine change. Now the point is that this may work when you're trying to win an election campaign. In order to make things better for people who want to start factories, you need to do a lot more than that.
Rajdeep.
You see, I think part of the problem is also is that we are, like it or not, a messy democracy. Let's be fair to the pride. We are not Singapore. You know, people want Narendra Modi, or Narendra Modi at times would like India to be Singapore, I guess, particularly when it comes to the media. But we are not Singapore. There will be questions raised. Every time you bring in a new legislation, every time you look to change the laws of the country, there will be resistance. There will be groups who will say that we have land acquisition is a good example. Land acquisition cannot be debated in the pink pages in the way Mihir may want, because out there are people who have a different impression of what it means when their land is acquired. The problem at the moment is that these groups have never been talked to by their politicians. I think reform has taken place in this country over the last 20 years by stealth. You know, वो पीछे से कर लो. Typical Indian, वो लोगों को मत बताओ कि क्या असलियत क्या है. If we started communicating, if we started actually talking to our people, and I think that's been the big disconnect in our democratic process, where we haven't involved local governments, local panchayats, and got them to really get involved in this reform process. It's not going to take place because the Prime Minister says so. And my worry with Mr. Modi, and indeed with the previous government, is a lot of this has taken place only in the bhavans in Delhi. India doesn't live in Delhi anymore. I mean, the real vibrancy of India is in the state capitals. And I think the future of India, and the future of reform, and the future of India really changing, is if India allows the Chennais, the Gandhinagars, even the Ranchis and the Raipurs to genuinely become, and Jaipur. You know, the fact is, Vasundhara has tried to bring in labor reform in this state and has tried to push it through. She's going to face resistance at some stage. And I think many politicians are still not completely convinced that reform is electorally successful. Every politician has been worried ever since Chandrababu lost about more than a decade ago, whether we can genuinely go through reforms and win elections. And our politicians are survivors. They are not here to cater to what the editors of newspapers or what economists have to say. They want to win elections. Until we can convince them that reform is electorally successful, they will continue to be caught in the kind of environment in which Mr. Modi also has to do his politics.
My last question to both of you, and then we'll go to the audience. We've all spoken about aspirations and how Modi has promised change. But one of the biggest hurdles that one can see, all of us can see, is that while Swachh Bharat has been spoken about and photo ops have been splashed all over the place, the people have not changed. The littering that I see even here, there are other caste people picking it up for you. It has not, none of the ideas that that he has mentioned in speeches have percolated or have been absorbed by the people to actually decide to change themselves. We Indians have not decided to change. We are still making demands like government is a colonial master, ke mai baap hame do. How about a revolution in which a person, each individual, is that possible? Because that's the only way all the reforms and changes that Modi has spoken about can happen, whether it's the girl child or whether it's cleanliness or sanitation or reforms in business or make in India. That can't happen unless each individual changes himself.
But to give him credit, I don't think anybody else, not for a really long time, maybe since Nehru, has tried to speak to people and get them to change. By and large, our politicians have been, assimilative leaders, take them. Nobody's talked to people, maybe because nobody else has had the authority that Modi has. Nobody's talked to people and said, like, for example, from Independence Day, in the Independence Day speech, the way the women are behaved within this country is a problem with the men, not with a problem with women.
Question your sons.
All right, question your sons. All right, nobody has tried, and I think he would completely agree with you that, people do need to change. I think that was what Swachh Bharat was about. And if you were to say, but people haven't changed yet, he said, so what? I'm here for 10 years, at least, and I'll still keep talking about it. I think that is genuinely what he will say to you. And I am not going to say that it's the wrong approach, because I think he completely agrees with you that people need to change. The problem is not there. The problem is at the political level, there is no opposition to him. There is nobody else saying there's no Congress or somebody else in the parliament saying, I think Swachh Bharat is awesome. What about the decentralization that goes along with it and that should turn it into something completely sustainable? All right? There is no Congress. Let me tell you, since you mentioned land acquisition.
Let me tell it, poor old Shashi Tharoor is there. Shashi Tharoor said Swachh Bharat is awesome, his party pulled him up.
No.
So that's the nature of our politics. Our politics has become so polarized
that even sanitation is political.
Nobody knows who's speaking for the. He should be able to say that without the party pulling him. Let me tell you about
the
land
nature
acquisition.
of our politics.
When the land acquisition ordinance came out, and it was the 30th or 31st of December, right? And typically with the, as I said, the cleverness of this government, it came out late at night. There was no way to get a proper response. A lot of people tried to call the Congress for a reply because this was about, it was a strong, it was a major dilution of the act that had been passed by the last government. Surely the Congress would have had something to say about it, right? Now, if you go back, you'll discover those articles were run without a response from the party that had originally passed the act. Why? Because nobody wanted to talk about the land acquisition ordinance. Why did nobody want to talk about the land acquisition ordinance? Because Rahul Gandhi was on holiday for New Year's and nobody could get through to him.
Rajdeep, can you address this?
So, how can you run an opposition like this? Forget about a country.
Rajdeep, can you address the issue of how difficult it is for these reforms or changes to take place in the country when the country is only aspirational and not willing to change themselves?
No, I think that's unfair. I'll give you an example of Surat. Surat in the early 90s was struck by plague. Go to Surat today, it's a chain city. And a lot of the work was done by a dedicated team of bureaucrats, municipal commissioners, who really worked on changing the way Surat looked at itself. It's possible. I think the irony is the Congress also had its own Swachh Bharat program. They didn't call it Swachh Bharat, they called it something else. Nirmal Bharat. And they also had Vidya Balan as their brand ambassador. But they were just not clever enough to market it as Mr. Modi is. Modi's great skill. He's a terrific communicator. And therefore, he's able to reach out to millions of people. I think that's a great skill he has. But the point of Surat is unless you have a bottom-up approach in India, this is not going to work top-down. It's not going to work where you put some kuda, the irony is there was this terrific scene where you put kuda on the main Rajpath and then the politician comes and sweeps it, or you have some corporate chieftain, struggling with the broom and making it look as if, so that she is shown in a photograph, or someone else is, some actor comes for an hour, and it's not going to work like that.
None of them ever held a broom in their lives.
No, it's going to
work. You
work.
can tell from the way they're holding it here.
These guys doing it like he was rowing a boat.
The biggest mistake we made the mistake 67 years ago. We failed to realize that India is going to work bottom up. We thought India will work top down. It cannot. It's just too large.
But I will make one small change, one small alter. I think that if you give people a particular pristine, not pristine, but semi-working environment, even Indians, all right, they want to keep
Even Indians?
Even Indians, because we're a tough country. We're a tough country. We don't respect public spaces by and large. But, look at the Delhi metro, right? Above ground, people shove. It's unpleasant. People are spitting into corners. Suddenly, you go underground, it's cleaner, it's calmer, it's cooler. People start queuing far more. Okay, I'm not saying it's perfect, but you can see the difference in people's behavior if you give them something that they feel pride in and something that looks clean and something they want to take care of. So, let's not give up just yet.
That's exactly what happened in Surat. That's exactly what happened. The Surat example is a good example. The commissioner went from mohalla to mohalla, telling them the importance of changing the face of Surat. Now,
because of the plague.
My problem with Mr. Modi, of course, is that he will take credit for Surat's cleanliness. He won't mention Mr. Rao. It's like when the milk, he made that great speech at Sri Ram College of Commerce. And he, virtually took credit for the milk revolution of Gujarat, forgetting that there was a gentleman called Dr. Varghese Kurian. So that, my worry is that, you have at the end of the day, you've got to make everyone feel involved. You've got to create heroes. You've got to make people feel that this is something they are part of. So if people feel part of Swachh Bharat, why not? It can work. It can become better.
Questions? Where's the mic? Yeah.
So my question is that why is the fake idea of development, like building flyovers, like when Mrs. Sheila Dikshit was in Delhi, the Delhiites were fed this idea that there's been development for the past 10 years when there was just flyovers being made and holes being dug in the ground. The fake idea of development has been, fed by the Congress and even by BJP so badly that flyovers and creating building buildings have become the entire fake idea of development, which is not development, which is just basic idea of, a civil order.
Mihir, you want to take...
Well, I think that you're absolutely right that there are aspects to which how we design our cities, such as Delhi, which are clearly for the middle and upper class, right? So I think that the Commonwealth Games was when Sheila Dikshit's decline began in Delhi. And in many ways, I think the Commonwealth Games is when the decline of the Congress began in Delhi, across the world, across the country. And the problem with the Commonwealth Games is not just the corruption. It was that people looked at this and said, we are displacing people from their homes. We are allowing people to build large sums of money. And for what? Okay, there is a flyover. The former sponsor of this festival, in fact, built this flyover from Noida to South Delhi. It ends nowhere. Okay, it ends at a stadium which was used once and will never be used again. And instead of being where people actually needed to go. So the truth is, I don't agree with you that we don't need better cities. I don't think it's a fake idea of development. I think that the way that we've gone about it so far has been completely unaccountable, and at some point that has to change.
He writes about this in his book, that we don't plan for the future, we just plan for the past. So that's why even...
You build one, chota flyovers, build big flyovers.
The day the flyover was built in Delhi, it was already choked. A question from this young man here.
Good afternoon, I'm Aryan Yashpal from Mayo College, and I would like to ask Mr. Sardesai as to what are his views on retrospective tax, and one, and two would be that what would be the factor of Mr. Rahul Gandhi not being a victorious politician, except the factor that he was not on social media.
Okay,
Could I ask you one question? Why are you interested in retroactive active tax? Do you pay taxes?
Because I wanted to ask that if the new government is pro-business now.
Okay.
Okay, I think Mihir should answer your retrospective tax question, but I will try and make sense of your Rahul Gandhi question, because I think that's an important transformation that has taken place in this country. I think India is far more attractive to self-made people than people who simply believe that based on their family surname, they should be in politics. Politics, this Jagirdari politics is coming to an end. Call it Zamindari or Jagirdari politics. That politics has to, and the irony of this India is everything starts with the Congress. The Congress created the Jagirdari, the family Raj. Now it's spread to every party, Lalu and family, Mulayam and family, Karunanidhi and family, Badals and family, and then they control the entire capital accumulation of a state. That kind of closed shop politics, I believe, will become increasingly subject to the law of diminishing. So Rahul Gandhi first, if I was advising him, I would tell him, Rahul, forget about Delhi. If you're really serious, go and spend the next 3 years in Lucknow and tell yourself, I will not come back to Delhi till I have won Uttar Pradesh. I will go to every mohalla, every day. I will fight Mulayam Singh Yadav, and I will prove that I can do a 9-to-5 job, or actually a 9-to-9. Politics is not even a 9-to-5. Rahul Gandhi needs to show me he's a 24/7 politician and go to Lucknow and spend the next 5 years. My respect for him will go up immensely. If he lives in Delhi and then spends his birthday, as I mentioned in the book, birthday in Europe, while congressmen are sitting with candles and birthday cakes and flowers outside his house, then I'm sorry, Rahul Gandhi and the Congress must both disappear.
Mihir, will you take the question? Will you take the question on retroactive taxes?
Well, yes. Well, thank you for asking that very, very important question that I think everyone had at the top of their minds. This is, look, the question of retrospective taxation, I'm not going to say specifically about retrospective taxation. There were a lot of things.
We have to end.
There were a lot of things that that the last government did that investors across the world got very upset by. Retrospective taxation was just the big iconic thing that irritated people, like for example Rahul Gandhi. Okay, so retrospective taxation stood for something, and that was the inability of the last government to sell India as a good place in which to do business. And I think that this government has, although it has not changed the retrospective taxation law, has in fact made India sound like a better place to do business. The truth is, until it starts changing the laws, such as the retrospective taxation law, it hasn't, the difference hasn't manifested itself on the ground. So they're still selling a story. Okay, incidentally, on the Rahul Gandhi thing, I just want to disagree with you. I don't think that it is just because he runs Jagirdari politics. I think that the truth is, as you mentioned, there are Jagirdari politicians all over the place. He's just bad at his job.
Maybe it's a job he doesn't want.
He's just
Really? Yes.
I want. Hello. Can I be heard?
Yes.
Okay. Bharatiyata, it needs a bucephalus. Which of you three would take it as the title of your new book?
Bhartiya?
It needs a...
Bharatiyata, it needs a bucephalus. Horse of Alexander.
Why do we need the horse of Alexander?
Because you won't find a more staunch supporter as of now.
I haven't...
Okay. Can you pass the mic to the row behind? Jonathan, he had his hand up. No, that's not Jonathan, whoever it is.
Excuse me,
Just-
ma'am.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Hi. A very good afternoon to the panel. First of all, I want to appreciate Mihir for bringing the Delhi Metro point. The government surely needs to appreciate and show faith in the citizens that, yeah, we can do it. Secondly, at the same time, I want to disagree with Mihir when he says that, I'm sure you should have visited more colleges in UP, that we are moving away from the socialist democratic idea. I'm sorry, we are not. We're still worried when the government, when you said that the prime time ordinances happen and the next day we get the news, and what is left with us is only the Hindu articles and the open net articles to analyze. So we're really worried about so I would request Mr. Sardesai to reflect on it, as it's a Modi audience, I guess, and how these ordinances just come up and then we just need to,
Is this a Modi audience?
I think
Is that
so,
what you
because
just said?
I'm not, so yeah.
show of hands.
I thought you were.
How many Modi supporters?
that-
Show of hands.
See, that's
it's
that's
not
precisely...
promoting.
That's about
That's
50%.
not promoting.
You've thrown up precisely the problem. Why should anyone be called a Modi audience or I may agree with some aspects of Modi, I may disagree with other aspects of Modi. Why? We have increasingly, and I believe your question hits at it, we have increasingly started labeling people. You are national, I am anti-national. One of the most amusing things that I find is NRIs sitting in Texas, who I
Advising
believe
us.
practice long-distance nationalism, will come and tell me how to run India and say, and if I then question Modi, because I believe NRIs are the ones today who are the ultimate Modi bhaks. Because when I see them on TV with their eyes, at times they think that he's the next avatar of Vishnu. And you can't say a word against. I can get away with questioning Modi in Gujarat,
But not
I
in
can't
Madison
get
Square
away in
Garden.
Madison Square Gardens, as I found to my cost.
And you can check that out on YouTube. You can watch Rajdeep Sardesai lose his shirt in New York, outside Madison Square Garden.
I shall not get into that.
I have to inform you that although the press has been writing about Narendra Modi's ordinances, if you look at it historically, more ordinances were passed by Jawaharlal Nehru, Indira Gandhi, and Manmohan Singh than the present government. So, you have to look at it historically.
Excuse me, ma'am.
We have to end. We have to end. I'm sorry.
I was technically recognized, so.
Where are you?
May I just,
Yeah,
Oh,
go ahead.
jaldi bolo, jaldi
Right,
bolo.
this is for Mr. Sharma. Going by the maths that you've put across and the lack of policy reforms in the
They're
job
screaming.
sector.
We have to stop.
This is kind of important, that's why.
Catch me after.
Or you can speak.
As long as you see me,
Yeah,
you
I'm right
I'll
here.
see.
All the questions not answered.
All
Rajdeep and
those who
Mihir
want to
are
ask
available.
questions, buy the book.
Yeah, Rajdeep.